The knock on the door came at 5:32 a.m. When police entered the stately white brick mansion of Judge Evelyn Hartman, they expected tragedy. What they found instead was horror cloaked in silence. Her husband, a celebrated heart surgeon, and their 3 adult children lay dead in separate bedrooms. No signs of struggle, no break-in, nothing stolen. The woman who once presided over Baltimore's toughest criminal cases stood in the middle of it all, calm, composed, and holding a cup of coffee. She told officers she had just woken up. But behind that calm face lay months of planning, a secret life, and a love affair that pushed one of the state's most respected judges to commit an unthinkable act. How does someone who embodied justice turn into the very evil they once condemned? And what drives a mother to destroy the family she built her entire life around? This is the story of Evelyn Hartman, the judge who used the law to plan the perfect crime. Before we unravel this chilling case, take a second to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss our next true crime deep dive. It really helps the channel reach more viewers who love stories that challenge what we think we know about justice and human nature. Now, let's step into the mansion and the mind of Judge Evelyn Hartman. For most of her career, Judge Evelyn Hartman was the embodiment of authority wrapped in poise. From the marble steps of Baltimore's Circuit Court to the pages of Maryland Law Review, her name carried a certain weight. Colleagues described her as measured, brilliant, almost surgically precise in the way she dissected arguments. But behind that careful control lived a woman whose life had been constructed like the stately Georgian mansion she called home, solid on the outside, quietly cracking beneath the surface. The Hartman residence stood on Greenvale Avenue, a long stretch of manicured lawns and gated driveways where wealth whispered rather than screamed. The house itself was almost cinematic. Pale stone, symmetrical windows trimmed in black, a broad staircase sweeping up to a mahogany door polished to a mirror-like gleam. It was the sort of place that appeared on the cover of architectural magazines, admired for its restraint and timelessness. To neighbors, the Hartmans were not just affluent, they were aspirational. A family that represented what success in America was supposed to look like when hard work, discipline, and intellect aligned perfectly. Inside, the family's rhythm moved like clockwork. Evelyn's husband, Dr. Richard Hartman, was one of the region's most respected cardiothoracic surgeons, known for a steady hand and an impossible schedule. Patients spoke of him as if he were part scientist, part saint. Their 3 children, Daniel, Grace, and Elliot, were adult mirrors of their parents' ambition. Daniel, the eldest at 38, worked in finance and lived just outside the city. Grace, 35, was a pediatrician following her father's path into medicine, and Elliot, the youngest at 32, was an architect designing low-income housing developments aimed at revitalizing Baltimore's neglected districts. Each of them bore the quiet, polished confidence of people who had been raised to achieve. Friends often said the Hartmans were the kind of family that sent thank-you cards within 24 hours and never argued in public. They hosted annual charity dinners, chaired hospital boards, and donated heavily to local education programs. If there were ever disagreements, they stayed within the walls of that house, muffled by good manners and old money. To most, Evelyn seemed to have mastered the delicate balance between career and family, running a courtroom by day and a household by night, always in control, always impeccably dressed. Yet those closest to her noticed subtle changes in the final years of her tenure. Her law clerks whispered about how she'd started lingering in her chambers after hours, staring at the city skyline through the window instead of reviewing case files. Her sentences, once known for their balance between compassion and firmness, began leaning heavier on the punitive side. "She's tired," one colleague had remarked. "Too many years seeing the worst of people can make you hard." But it wasn't hardness that was setting in. It was restlessness. Evelyn's sense of identity had long been intertwined with power. The gavel, the bench, the courtroom silence that followed her words. Retirement, when it came, was supposed to be a victory lap. Instead, it felt like exile. After stepping down at 60, she found herself adrift in a world that no longer required her verdicts or her control. Richard, ever consumed by his research and the endless emergencies that accompanied it, seemed relieved by her newfound free time, at first. He assumed she would take up gardening, perhaps join one of the neighborhood committees she had always declined. Instead, she grew distant, brittle, and unpredictable. There were mornings when she didn't speak at all, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee cooling in her hands, staring at nothing. Her children noticed it too. During family dinners, Grace would glance toward her mother when conversation fell silent, as if testing the air. Daniel, the pragmatic banker, dismissed it as post-retirement blues. "She just needs a project," he had said once, pouring another glass of wine. "She's been running at 100 miles an hour for 20 years. Of course she's restless." Only Elliot seemed to sense the deeper fracture. "It's like she's angry at something none of us can see," he told his partner one evening. "Like she's trapped inside her own life." If the cracks were invisible to outsiders, it was because Evelyn made sure they stayed that way. To the public, she was still Judge Hartman, graceful, articulate, composed. She continued attending charity galas and speaking engagements, each time delivering polished remarks about justice and integrity. But inside, resentment simmered like a slow, controlled burn. Her marriage, once a partnership of equals, now felt like a contract of obligation. Her children, though successful, no longer needed her guidance. For the first time in her life, she had no audience, no purpose that made her indispensable. And for someone who had built her identity on control, the feeling of irrelevance was intolerable. It was around this time that she met Adrian Cole. Adrian wasn't from Evelyn's world. At 47, he was a defense attorney, charming, articulate, but with the sort of charisma that made his peers both admire and distrust him. He'd appeared before her courtroom several times in the years before her retirement, defending clients with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. She had admired his sharpness, even when she overruled him. Their professional relationship had always been tinged with an unspoken tension, a mutual recognition of intellect. When she ran into him at a legal conference 2 years after stepping down, that tension flared into something more dangerous. What began as coffee after a panel discussion turned into lunches, then late-night phone calls. Adrian had a way of making Evelyn feel visible again. Where her family saw her as predictable, he treated her as mysterious, even alluring. He listened when she spoke about her disillusionment with the justice system, about the hypocrisy she'd seen from the bench. "You spent your life playing by rules written by men who never wanted women to win," he once told her. "Maybe it's time you started writing your own." Those words, meant as a flirtation, became something far more intoxicating to her. Soon, the affair that began in hotel rooms on the outskirts of the city evolved into whispered promises of escape. They spoke of new beginnings, Lisbon perhaps, or Prague, places where no one knew them as judge and lawyer, where they could start over without judgment. For Adrian, it was fantasy. For Evelyn, it was blueprint. At home, the distance between her and Richard became an open wound. He noticed the way she flinched when he touched her shoulder, the way her phone never left her side. Their conversations turned mechanical, confined to bills, schedules, and family logistics. When Grace announced her engagement, Evelyn feigned excitement, but her mind was elsewhere, calculating, rationalizing. Each of her children represented a tether to a life she no longer wanted, obligations that anchored her to the very existence she now despised. To outsiders, however, the Hartmans still appeared perfect. Photographs from that year show the family smiling at charity galas, Evelyn's hand resting lightly on Richard's arm, her eyes soft under the camera's flash. But if you look closely, really closely, There's something distant in her expression, like she's performing a role she's already decided to abandon. Neighbors would later recall the way she started taking long drives alone at odd hours, often returning just before dawn. Her assistant at the Courthouse Foundation said she began closing her office door for hours at a time, claiming she was reviewing old case notes. In reality, she was researching something else entirely: pharmaceutical overdoses, undetectable toxins, and the limits of forensic toxicology. She wasn't preparing for another case, she was preparing for freedom. By the summer of 2020, the plan, though still unspoken, was already taking shape in her mind. Adrian had become both her confidant and her accomplice in fantasy. They exchanged encrypted messages about new lives and starting fresh, though he assumed it was about divorce. Evelyn never mentioned divorce. In her world, divorce was messy, public, unbecoming. No, her solution would be cleaner, more permanent, and, she believed, foolproof. She had seen hundreds of murder cases cross her bench. She knew the patterns investigators followed, the mistakes killers made. Most acted out of rage or impulse. She, by contrast, would act out of reason. The irony was not lost on her, that she, who had once upheld justice, would now weaponize it. To her, it felt almost poetic, a final verdict, delivered by the only judge she had ever truly trusted, herself. Her husband's promotion to chief of cardiology in September provided the perfect pretext for a family celebration. She volunteered to host dinner, insisting it would be intimate, just the family. Daniel promised to bring his wife, Grace would come with her fiancé, and Elliot would drive in from D.C. for the weekend. Evelyn smiled as she sent out the invitations, her tone cheerful, her words affectionate. "It's been too long since we've all been together," she wrote. No one suspected anything sinister. Why would they? It was just dinner, one more tradition in a life that looked, from the outside, so enviably complete. In the days leading up to the dinner, Evelyn moved through her home with a calm precision that masked the enormity of what she was about to do. She polished the silver herself, arranged fresh lilies in crystal vases, even replaced the tablecloth with one she had bought years ago but never used. Her husband noticed her sudden domestic enthusiasm and teased her about going all out. She laughed, brushing it off. "Just trying to make it special," she said, and in a way she meant it. It would be special, just not in the way he imagined. To her, it was already over. The life she had lived for 60 years had reached its closing argument. All that remained was to deliver the final sentence. Outside, the late summer light bathed the mansion in gold as preparations for that fatal dinner began. The neighborhood dogs barked, oblivious. The world carried on, unaware that inside that immaculate house, a judge was preparing to commit the one crime she had spent her life condemning. And when the table was finally set, crystal glasses shining, candles flickering in their brass holders, it looked like perfection itself. Only Evelyn knew it was a tableau of death, an ending disguised as celebration. The stage was ready. The audience, her family, would soon arrive. The evening of September 12, 2020, began the way countless family gatherings do: warm light spilling from kitchen windows, the smell of roasting vegetables, the soft hum of jazz in the background. Yet beneath the comforting normalcy of it all, something darker pulsed quietly. The Hartman home, normally so still and composed, felt alive in a way it hadn't for years. The dining room glowed under a chandelier whose crystals scattered the light like fragments of glass. The mahogany table gleamed, freshly polished, set with porcelain china rimmed in gold. To anyone walking in, it was a scene of elegance and care. To Evelyn Hartman, it was the culmination of months of methodical preparation. She moved through the kitchen with deliberate grace, every motion controlled. The way she sliced the beef tenderloin, the way she stirred the reduction sauce, the way she measured, down to the milligram, the crushed white powder she would later dissolve. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind so many times that it no longer felt like a crime. It felt like closure. The act itself had been rationalized into a kind of liberation, an end to the web of expectations that had defined her life. Every sound in that kitchen, the clinking of crystal, the simmer of sauce, felt amplified, almost ceremonial. Outside, the evening sky deepened into a watercolor gradient of purple and blue as the first car pulled into the driveway. Daniel, punctual as always, arrived with his wife, Julia. Their laughter floated through the entryway before they even rang the bell, the easy laughter of people untouched by suspicion. Evelyn greeted them with her practiced warmth, hugging them both, inhaling the familiar scent of her son's cologne, woody, clean, confident. "You look wonderful, Mom," Daniel said, stepping back to take in the house. "Everything looks perfect," she smiled. "I try." A few minutes later, Grace arrived, balancing a bouquet of hydrangeas and a bottle of wine. Her fiancé, Robert, followed close behind, offering his usual polite nod to Evelyn. "For the table," Grace said brightly. "They were your favorite." Evelyn accepted the flowers with a soft smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "They still are," she said. Finally, Elliot's car rolled up the circular drive, his headlights sweeping across the manicured lawn. He always came last, always running a few minutes behind, always apologetic. He hugged his mother tightly, whispering something about traffic and construction delays. Evelyn squeezed his shoulder in response. "You made it," she said softly. "That's what matters." He didn't notice how tightly she held on before letting go. Dinner began like any other Hartman family celebration. The conversation was polite, occasionally teasing, the air filled with the clinking of cutlery and bursts of laughter that echoed off the high ceilings. Richard, ever the storyteller, recounted a surgical triumph from earlier that month. "A patient's heart so fragile it shouldn't have survived another hour," he said. Grace teased him for dramatizing it. Daniel talked about a new investment project, Elliot about his latest design proposal. Evelyn floated between them, attentive, graceful, refilling glasses, adjusting plates, asking questions that kept the conversation flowing. No one noticed the faint tension in her movements, the slight tremor in her hands that she disguised as fatigue. Her husband's favorite dish, beef Wellington, was the centerpiece, surrounded by roasted vegetables, buttered asparagus, and a bottle of vintage Bordeaux decanted hours before. Every detail had been chosen with care. Every sip, every bite had been planned. The first round of drinks was wine, the second was sparkling water, poured from chilled glass bottles. Evelyn had crushed the sedative tablets earlier that afternoon, mixing them with a small amount of liquid until they dissolved completely, leaving no visible trace. She poured carefully, too carefully perhaps, but no one noticed. Why would they? It was her kitchen, her ritual. She served everyone else first, her own glass last, untouched except for a feigned sip when eyes were on her. As the meal progressed, time seemed to bend. The laughter grew softer, more languid. The room's warmth turned heavy, as if the air itself were thickening. Evelyn watched her family through the soft haze of candlelight. Her husband mid-sentence, Daniel leaning back in his chair, Grace's eyes sparkling as she recounted a story from medical school, Elliot gesturing animatedly as he spoke about his architectural project. They looked perfect. For a fleeting moment, she hesitated. A flicker of doubt crossed her face. Small, almost imperceptible, but it passed as quickly as it came. Richard lifted his glass for a toast. "To family," he said, voice strong, confident. "To love that endures." Evelyn raised her glass, her smile a practiced mask. "To love," she echoed. As the wine touched her lips, the irony struck her like a distant echo. Love had not endured. Love had curdled into something unrecognizable. When dessert arrived, a delicate chocolate souffle, baked just long enough to puff perfectly, Evelyn's movements were almost serene. She topped each serving with a dusting of powdered sugar, steady hands betraying none of the chaos beneath her calm. Her mind moved in precise sequence, timing each action. Pour, serve, smile, wait. By 10:30 p.m., conversation had slowed. Daniel and Grace began gathering their things, laughing softly as they teased Elliot about staying behind to help clean up. Richard kissed his wife's cheek and thanked her for a perfect evening. Evelyn's response was soft, almost tender. "I'm glad you were all here." They didn't see the meaning behind the words. Grace and Daniel drove off into the night, promising to call in the morning. Elliot retreated to the guest room upstairs, exhausted from the long drive. Richard lingered a while longer, watching his wife load dishes into the sink. "You outdid yourself tonight," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. She turned to face him. For a moment, something almost like sorrow flickered in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Get some rest." He kissed her forehead and disappeared down the hall. The house fell silent, the kind of silence that doesn't just fill space. It presses against the skin, heavy and absolute. Evelyn stood in the kitchen, hands braced on the counter, breathing slowly. In the distance, she could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Each second felt stretched, deliberate, echoing through the empty rooms. When she finally climbed the stairs, she moved like a ghost through the dimly lit hallway. She paused at the door to the guest room, her hand resting on the frame. Inside, Elliot was already asleep, his breathing slow, even. She watched him for a long moment before turning away. In the master bedroom, Richard slept soundly, his breathing deep, unaware that his heart, so strong, so steady, was already slowing. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed beside him, staring at his face in the faint light spilling through the curtains. He looked peaceful, almost angelic. She reached out, brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, and whispered, "It's over." At 11:47 p.m., she called Adrian. Her voice was calm, detached. "It's done," she said. There was a pause on the line, a long breath. "Evelyn," Adrian began, his tone cautious, uncertain. "What do you mean?" But she didn't answer. She ended the call, turned off the light, and sat in the dark. The hours that followed were strangely quiet. She didn't sleep, she didn't cry, she simply waited, listening to the slow unraveling of the world she had built. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, she rehearsed what she would say when the police arrived. She would sound composed, concerned, confused, but not hysterical. She knew exactly how grief was supposed to sound. She had seen it performed 100 times in her courtroom. At 7:43 a.m., she dialed 911. Her voice was steady, eerily calm. "This is Judge Evelyn Hartman at 4729 Greenvale," she said. "My husband isn't breathing. My son as well. I think something's wrong with the air in the house." It was the first lie of many. By the time paramedics arrived, the house had already transformed back into a tableau of calm domesticity. Evelyn greeted them at the door, still dressed in her nightrobe, hair neatly pinned, as though hosting unexpected guests. Her tone was factual, composed. Too composed. The responders later said she sounded like she was reporting a case, not a death. When the officers entered the master bedroom, they found Richard lying still, no signs of trauma. Upstairs, Elliot appeared the same. No bruises, no struggle, no clue. Within an hour, news began filtering in. Both Daniel and Grace had been found unresponsive in their own homes. 5 lives had entered the night together. By morning, only 1 remained. The morning of September 13th, 2020, began with a stillness that felt almost sacred. The neighborhood was just waking, The slow churn of sprinklers, the rustle of newspaper deliveries, the faint hum of distant traffic bleeding into the air. But inside the Hartman mansion, silence reigned like a held breath. Sunlight filtered through the gauze curtains of the master bedroom, falling across Richard Hartman's still body. His face, serene and composed, betrayed nothing of the violence that had taken place, because there had been none. No struggle, no fight, no sound to suggest his final moments had been anything other than sleep. Upstairs, in the guest room, his youngest son lay the same way, peaceful, untouched, gone. Downstairs in the kitchen, Evelyn Hartman sat at the table with a cup of coffee cooling in her hands. The air smelled faintly of the previous night's dinner, a mix of wine and roasted meat, the same aromas that had accompanied laughter, conversation, the illusion of togetherness. She stared at the steam curling from her mug, as if hypnotized by its slow, ghostly dance. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Each second sounded louder than the last, marking the slow approach of what she knew she had to do next. She had rehearsed it in her mind for days, the call, the tone, the pauses between words. She knew what genuine panic sounded like. It was uneven, breathless, chaotic. She wouldn't do that. Panic drew attention. Calm inspired trust. She had spent decades listening to liars in her courtroom, watching their eyes, studying their speech. She had learned that the most convincing lie was the one delivered with poise. So, when she finally reached for the phone and dialed 911, her voice came out exactly as planned, low, measured, the kind of calm that unnerved those who heard it. "This is Judge Evelyn Hartman," she began. The words carried the same authority she had used on the bench. "I believe my husband isn't breathing. My son either. They're unresponsive." The dispatcher asked if she had checked for a pulse. Evelyn responded without hesitation. "Yes. Nothing. I don't understand what's happened." Her tone wavered just enough to sound human, but not enough to betray calculation. When asked if she needed an ambulance, she answered softly, "Yes, please. Quickly." The call lasted 1 minute and 47 seconds. When it ended, she placed the phone gently on the counter and took a slow breath. Her reflection in the microwave door looked almost unfamiliar. The calm, pale woman staring back at her was not the same one who had stood in this kitchen hours earlier, stirring wine into sauce. There was something emptied behind her eyes, something cold and precise. At 7:52 a.m., the first responders arrived. The wail of sirens fractured the still morning air, bouncing off the stone facades of neighboring homes. A paramedic named Jasmine Williams was the first to enter. She would later recall the surreal quiet of that moment, the way the house felt too still, too tidy. Evelyn met her at the door, her face composed, her robe tied neatly at the waist. "They're upstairs," she said, her voice even, almost detached. Jasmine expected tears, shaking, the disarray that came with sudden loss. Instead, she found a woman who looked more like a witness than a widow. The paramedics moved quickly. Richard was pronounced dead at 7:58 a.m. Elliot, minutes later. No signs of struggle, no visible injuries. Both bodies already showing the early stiffness of rigor mortis, suggesting they'd been gone for hours. Evelyn stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching. "Could it be the gas?" she asked quietly. "Maybe a leak?" The question hung in the air, deliberately vague, plausible. While the EMTs notified police, Evelyn made another call, this one to Daniel's office. She told his assistant that her son might be late, that something had happened at home. When she hung up, she sat again at the kitchen table, the coffee still untouched. The officers began their preliminary sweep of the house, noting the absence of any forced entry. Everything was immaculate. The table set for 5, the wine glasses drying neatly in the dishwasher, candles burned down to nubs. Nothing appeared out of place, and yet everything felt wrong. By 8:45 a.m., the situation had taken a strange turn. Two separate calls came through to the precinct, both from across town. In one, Daniel's building manager reported finding him unresponsive in his downtown condo after a colleague, alarmed that he hadn't shown up for work, had asked for a wellness check. In the other, Grace's fiancé called from their shared apartment. He had come home from a night shift to find her lifeless in bed. The coincidence was staggering. 4 members of the same family, dead within hours of each other, all without visible cause. When the detective on scene, Lieutenant Dominic Myers, received the update, he froze mid-note. He'd worked homicides across Baltimore for over 2 decades, seen everything from drug wars to domestic tragedies. But this defied logic. He turned to his partner, Detective Alicia Ramsey, and muttered, "Either God's got a cruel sense of humor, or something's very, very wrong." They entered the house at 9:10 a.m., the scent of disinfectant and breakfast coffee mixing oddly with the air of quiet luxury. Evelyn was sitting exactly where she had been when the paramedics arrived, posture straight, eyes clear. "Mrs. Hartman," Myers said, his voice gentle. "I'm Detective Myers. I'm so sorry for your loss. We just need to ask you a few questions." She nodded. "Of course." Myers later said it was her composure that first set off alarm bells. Most people, he said, either break down or retreat into silence. But Evelyn did neither. She spoke clearly, efficiently, almost helpfully. She explained how everyone had been fine the night before, how they'd toasted Richard's promotion, laughed, eaten, gone to bed, content. "It was a perfect evening," she said. Then, as if remembering her role, she added softly, "until it wasn't." Her choice of words struck Myers immediately. There was something off in the phrasing, too reflective, too deliberate. He scribbled a note in his pad. Observe tone, controlled. The medical examiner's van arrived around 10. Dr. Lydia Reeves, Baltimore's chief medical examiner, personally took charge of the case. The sheer improbability of 4 sudden deaths in a single family demanded it. Reeves was known for her precision and her instinct. Within minutes, she could tell something wasn't adding up. There were no external injuries, no signs of carbon monoxide exposure, and yet all the victims had the same faint bluish tint around the lips, a subtle marker she'd seen before, one that whispered of poisoning. Meanwhile, Evelyn made another curious move. As the bodies were being removed, she called a local funeral home, one her family had used in the past, and inquired about coordinated services. The timing struck everyone as strange. Hours after finding her husband and son dead, before any autopsies or police conclusions, she was already discussing arrangements. Later, investigators would note the meticulousness of her requests: matching mahogany caskets, expedited cremation, minimal press. Outside, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Police cars lined the street. Reporters began circling like vultures once word spread that the victims were the family of a judge. Cameramen gathered at the gates, lenses aimed at the house where the story had just begun to unfold. Inside, Myers and Ramsey moved methodically through each room, documenting every detail. In the kitchen, they found wine glasses and water bottles neatly stacked in the dishwasher, the residue still faintly visible on the rims. On the counter, an open prescription bottle, Zolpidem, a common sleep aid, caught Ramsey's eye. She jotted it down, thinking little of it. At that moment, it was just another detail in a sea of them. When Evelyn was asked if her husband or children had taken any medications, she shook her head. "Richard kept to vitamins mostly. The kids are healthy. I take something for sleep now and then. That's mine." Her tone was almost apologetic, as though confessing to a minor indulgence. By late afternoon, the bodies had been transported to the medical examiner's office. Evelyn watched the last van pull away from the driveway, her face unreadable. Neighbors peered from behind lace curtains, whispering theories: gas leak, food poisoning, even carbon monoxide. None imagined that the woman standing calmly on the steps might be the architect of it all. Detective Myers stayed behind, taking one last look around. The faint smell of red wine still lingered, and for a fleeting moment, he imagined the scene as it must have been the night before. Warm, alive, full of laughter. "A perfect evening," he repeated under his breath, the irony not lost on him. That night, as darkness swallowed the city, the wheels of investigation began turning. The autopsies were fast-tracked, the lab technicians briefed, the police reports filed. But somewhere in that vast machinery of justice, Evelyn Hartman slept in her immaculate home, alone now, her world reduced to quiet and memory. In her dream, or perhaps it was just wishful thinking, she stood in a courtroom again, the judge's bench gleaming beneath the lights. Only this time, the gavel was in someone else's hand, and she was standing below, waiting for a verdict she already knew was coming. By the following morning, the headlines had already begun to bloom across the city. "Tragedy strikes prominent Baltimore family. Former judge's husband and children found dead." The story moved fast, too fast for the facts to catch up. Speculation filled the gaps where truth had yet to surface. Gas leak, bad wine, undiagnosed condition, every theory but the right one. News anchors spoke of Judge Evelyn Hartman with reverence, framing her as a pillar of justice brought to her knees by unthinkable loss. But inside the Baltimore Police Department's Homicide Division, the mood was different. Detective Dominic Myers sat behind his cluttered desk, staring at the preliminary toxicology report that had landed just an hour earlier. He didn't like coincidences, and this one was too neat to be real. Across from him, Detective Alicia Ramsey scanned the file. The data was sparse, but enough to raise alarm. All 4 victims showed the same elevated levels of an unidentifiable compound consistent with central nervous system depression. "Could be a sedative," she murmured. "Zolpidem, maybe? But these levels, this isn't normal dosage range." Myers rubbed his jaw, eyes narrowing. "What's the chance they all took the same thing by accident?" Ramsey looked up. 0. The pair had worked together long enough to communicate without words. There was something about this case that smelled off, not in the literal sense, but in the way small details refused to fit. 4 people, all healthy, all dead within hours, with no sign of violence or forced entry. If not a coordinated poisoning, then what? A pact? A shared illness? The logical explanations collapsed under scrutiny, one by one, until only the improbable remained. By mid-morning, Myers and Ramsey were at the medical examiner's office, watching Dr. Lydia Reeves move through her work like a surgeon conducting a symphony. Her gloves snapped, scalpels glinted under fluorescent light, and her voice was calm but cutting. "We're looking at respiratory suppression," she said without preamble. "They went down easy. No convulsions, no trauma. Whatever it was, it acted fast and clean." She gestured toward Richard's chart. "This man's heart was healthy as an ox. You don't get this kind of simultaneous failure without help." Reeves was one of those rare examiners who treated death like a language, every bruise, every shade of skin tone, every residue a syllable. "I'll need more time," she said, "but my gut says we're dealing with something synthetic, not your garden variety sedative, something engineered to fade." Myers scribbled notes, but his eyes were on her face. "You think it's deliberate?" Reeves met his gaze, unflinching. "I think nothing about this is natural." Back at the Hartman house, the forensic team combed through every inch of the property. The kitchen counter still held faint rings from wine glasses. On the stovetop, a pot of sauce sat congealed, untouched since that night. The dishwasher cycle had run, an odd move for someone who supposedly woke to find her family dead. People in shock rarely clean up. They found no signs of a break-in, no foreign prints, nothing stolen. But in the trash, Buried beneath a layer of paper towels and food scraps was a small glass vial with trace residue. The label had been peeled off. When Myers held it up in a gloved hand, Ramsey leaned closer. "That looks pharmaceutical." He nodded. "Yeah, but the question is, what kind?" Meanwhile, Evelyn's public facade held perfectly. She appeared at the precinct when summoned, dressed in muted gray, her composure immaculate. Even in grief, she projected authority. The detectives offered condolences, but her responses were curiously formal, rehearsed. When Myers asked if her family had enemies, she gave a soft laugh, the kind that almost sounded offended. "Detective, my husband saved lives for a living. My children followed in his footsteps. Enemies? No. We were ordinary despite appearances." Ordinary. The word echoed through Myers's mind as he watched her. There was nothing ordinary about her. Most widows couldn't sit through questioning without trembling. She barely blinked. Her gaze was steady, polite, unnervingly calm. Every word seemed curated. Ramsey later described it as talking to a marble statue. As the interview wrapped up, Myers asked casually, "You mentioned last night's dinner. Did everyone eat the same thing?" Evelyn nodded. "Yes, I prepared a single menu, beef Wellington, roasted vegetables, chocolate souffle." "And the drinks?" Myers pressed. "Wine for most of us. I had water later." She smiled faintly, the expression brittle around the edges. "I don't hold my liquor like I used to." That line, too light for the moment, stuck with him. As they left the room, he muttered to Ramsey, "She's performing. The question is, why?" That night, the forensic lab returned partial results from the wine glasses collected at the scene. 3 of the 5 tested positive for traces of zolpidem, but at concentrations that didn't make sense. The doses were lethal, not accidental, not therapeutic, lethal. The only glasses without residue? Evelyn's. Myers stared at the report for a long time before sliding it across the table. "There's your pattern," he said quietly. 3 glasses dosed, her glass clean, no forced entry, no robbery. You tell me what we're looking at." Ramsey hesitated. "We're looking at the judge." The implications were enormous. Accusing a former judge, especially one with Evelyn's reputation, wasn't something you did lightly. Every move had to be airtight, every fact beyond dispute. But as the evidence trickled in, the picture sharpened. The vial from the trash tested positive for a rare compound used in research sedatives, something not commercially available. The order records traced back to a small biotech supplier in New Jersey. The purchase had been made 3 months earlier under a false name. The shipping address? A P.O. box registered to E. Hartman. When confronted, Evelyn denied it smoothly. "I have no idea what that is," she said, her tone calm but clipped. "Someone must have used my name. You're mistaken." But the veneer of certainty had begun to crack. Myers saw it in the brief flicker of her eyes, the faint tightening of her jaw. Outside the precinct, the press had turned her grief into theater. Cameras followed her from the parking lot to her car, reporters shouting questions. "Judge Hartman, was this foul play? Do you have any suspects?" She paused only once, turning to face them with perfect poise. "My only concern," she said, "is finding out what happened to my family. I trust the system I served for 30 years. It was a calculated statement, a reminder of her authority, her familiarity with justice. Yet to Myers, it sounded like deflection. Over the next week, the investigation deepened. Surveillance footage showed Evelyn at a pharmacy 2 days before the dinner, purchasing over-the-counter sleep aids and a box of syringes. The receipt was time-stamped at 3:17 p.m., a detail she had neglected to mention. Meanwhile, technicians uncovered deleted messages from her phone, encrypted exchanges with a contact saved only as AC. The content was partially recoverable, but one line stood out. "After this weekend, everything changes. The phrase was ambiguous, but context was everything. When they traced AC back to Adrian Cole, the defense attorney who had appeared in several of her cases, the puzzle began to form its cruel outline. Cole admitted to the affair under pressure, but swore ignorance of the murders. "We talked about leaving," he told investigators. "About starting over, but not like this. She never said anything about them." In her home, hidden in a drawer behind old court transcripts, investigators found a small notebook. The entries were sparse, cryptic. Most were logistical: dates, measurements, a few initials. But on one page, a line written in her elegant cursive stood alone. "Freedom requires sacrifice." It wasn't evidence in itself, but to Myers, it read like confession. The following morning, he sat in the observation room watching Evelyn through the one-way glass as she waited for another round of questioning. She sat perfectly still, her posture flawless, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The calm was unsettling, less grief, more control. "You ever seen someone like this?" Ramsey asked quietly. Myers shook his head. "Yeah," he said finally. "On the bench." When they entered the room, Evelyn looked up, composed as ever. "Detectives," she greeted politely. Myers didn't waste time. "Mrs. Hartman, we've obtained some new information. We've traced a chemical compound found in your husband's system to a purchase made under your name. Can you explain that?" For the first time, her voice faltered. "That's absurd," she said sharply. "You think I would hurt my own family?" Her tone rose, not in grief, but indignation. "My God, the people I raised, the man I built my life with?" She leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You're chasing a ghost. You want a story that fits your narrative because you can't accept coincidence." Myers let the silence hang. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "I don't believe in coincidence, Judge. You taught us not to." The air thickened between them, a slow suffocation of truth. Evelyn looked away first, her gaze settling on the reflection of herself in the glass. For a fleeting second, her expression broke. Something fragile flickered behind the mask. Regret, maybe, or realization. Then it was gone. By the time she left the station that evening, the tide had turned. The evidence was aligning, the narrative closing in. And for the first time since that morning, the woman who once controlled every room she entered was no longer in charge. Outside, the reporters shouted her name again, but she didn't respond. She just kept walking, her heels clicking on the pavement like a metronome counting down the seconds to the inevitable. The investigation had officially become a homicide case, and the judge who once delivered justice now stood squarely in its crosshairs. In the days that followed her questioning, Evelyn Hartman's once pristine life began to fracture like glass under pressure. What had once seemed impeccable, a woman of intellect, elegance, and unshakable control, was now being re-examined under the merciless lens of suspicion. The newspapers still called her Judge Hartman out of habit, but there was an edge to the way anchors said her name now, a faint pause before it, as though even they sensed the contradiction between what she had been and what she might have done. The community that had once held her in reverence now watched her with quiet horror, neighbors lowering their voices as she passed by on her morning walks, pretending politeness but stepping aside just a little too quickly. Behind the heavy curtains of her home, Evelyn spent her days in a strange twilight between delusion and dread. The police had not charged her, yet, but the investigation had begun to orbit her with suffocating precision. Every knock at the door made her flinch. Every passing car made her peek through the blinds. She had lived her life by logic and control, but now both were slipping. Her routines, once immaculate, had disintegrated. Coffee went cold, meals uneaten, and the silence that filled her home grew heavier each day, like the air before a storm. But while the police focused on toxicology and forensic timelines, another story was beginning to surface, one hidden beneath the surface of Evelyn's carefully curated existence. For every lie that had built her facade, there had been a truth buried underneath, waiting to be unearthed. Detective Myers had always trusted patterns more than instinct, but this case defied both. It wasn't until the discovery of a second bank account, an offshore holding in the Cayman Islands registered under E.H. Holdings Limited, that the full shape of Evelyn's hidden life began to emerge. The account had been opened nearly 3 years earlier, around the same time her restlessness had begun to show. The transactions were methodical, the deposits modest enough to avoid attention. Small transfers from shell accounts linked to consulting fees, property dividends, and a handful of anonymous donors who didn't seem to exist. It was a financial labyrinth, one only a lawyer or a judge could have constructed. When the detectives confronted her financial advisor, a man named Leo Sutherland, his discomfort was palpable. "She said it was for charity," he stammered, hands shaking slightly as he reviewed the documents. "A foundation she was starting. Something about education initiatives for women in law. It sounded legitimate." But the foundation never existed. The account, as it turned out, was a ghost vault for nearly $1.8 million. Money siphoned from various legal consulting retainers Evelyn had arranged after retirement. It wasn't theft exactly, but it wasn't clean either. At the same time, her phone records painted a parallel narrative, hundreds of calls and encrypted messages exchanged with Adrian Cole, the defense attorney who had once admired her intellect and later shared her bed. The correspondence was intimate, but also conspiratorial. They spoke of escape, of starting fresh, of being untethered. But more telling than the romance was the timeline. Their communication spiked dramatically in the weeks leading up to the murders, then stopped cold the morning after. When Adrian was brought in again for questioning, he looked like a man unraveling. Gone was the confident swagger of the courtroom. In its place was something frayed and hollow. "I didn't know what she planned," he said, voice low, eyes darting toward the door as if hoping she might walk in and rescue him. "She told me she was done with her life here, that she wanted a new beginning. I thought she meant divorce. I swear to God I didn't know." Myers leaned forward across the table. "You expect me to believe a woman like Evelyn Hartman, structured, methodical, just decided to run away on a whim? You didn't think to ask where the money was coming from, or what she meant when she said, 'No strings attached this time'?" Adrian hesitated, guilt flickering across his face like a shadow. "She said she was cutting ties. I didn't press her. She could be intense, obsessive even." He swallowed hard. But she wasn't insane. She was convinced, like she'd already made peace with something the rest of us couldn't see. Back at the station, Ramsey replayed snippets of Evelyn's interviews. Her voice, always calm, deliberate, seemed to carry an echo of superiority, as though she still believed herself one step ahead. "She's still playing judge," Ramsey said one night, leaning over the soundboard. "Only this time the case is her own." Myers nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "and she's banking on a mistrial." As investigators dug deeper, a pattern of emotional isolation emerged. Friends described Evelyn as distant but elegant, a woman who was always present but never open. Her closest confidants admitted they hadn't seen her smile genuinely in years. "It was like she'd forgotten how," one former colleague said. "Even her laughter sounded rehearsed. There was something brittle about her perfection, something that made people uneasy once they thought about it too long." In her journals recovered from a locked cabinet in her study, Evelyn wrote with startling detachment about her family. The entries were sparse, clinical, almost like legal notes. "Daniel has lost empathy. Grace is all calculation. Richard lives for acclaim. Elliot still believes kindness is a virtue, but not for long." Her words were both judgment and prophecy, the detached observations of someone analyzing her loved ones as case studies rather than human beings. The most chilling line appeared near the end of one notebook. "They have become strangers, and I owe them nothing." But what haunted Myers most was a small envelope found tucked behind one of the legal texts on her bookshelf. Inside was a photograph, black and white, faded at the corners. Evelyn and Adrian stood together at a legal conference in D.C., her hand resting subtly against his arm, both smiling in a way that suggested secrets. On the back, in her handwriting, were 4 words: "No turning back now." Every new discovery added another layer to the portrait of a woman who had mastered the art of disguise. Beneath the robes of justice, she had been orchestrating an escape that required not just deceit, but destruction. The evidence no longer painted her as a woman undone by grief, but as one consumed by resentment, a resentment so deep it demanded a purge of everything that reminded her of failure. Her marriage to Richard had long turned transactional, built on appearances and obligation. He was the symbol of everything she resented about her old life: the prestige, the expectation, the suffocating weight of perfection. Her children, once the anchors of her pride, had grown into reflections of him, ambitious, clinical, untouchable. To her, they were a living reminder that she had built something beautiful, but hollow, something that looked like success but felt like imprisonment. The affair with Adrian hadn't been just about passion, it had been about power. With him, she felt seen, not as an aging judge or mother, but as a woman still capable of control. He became both her obsession and her catalyst, the spark that reignited her will, but in the wrong direction. What began as fantasy metastasized into motive. By the time the detectives pieced together the financial trail, the affair, and the chemical procurement, a chilling realization set in. Evelyn's plan hadn't been spontaneous. It had been architected with the precision of a legal argument, each step justified, each loose end tied. The poison, the dinner, the cleanup, it all fit into a sequence that only someone deeply familiar with forensic procedure could have designed. She hadn't underestimated the system. She had counted on it, on the very rules she once enforced to protect her. And yet, for all her calculation, she had made one crucial mistake. She had left too much order behind. Crime, by its nature, was chaotic. But Evelyn's world was too neat, too symmetrical, too calm. The dishwasher had been run, the wine glasses aligned. Even her tone in the 911 call had been too measured. The very perfection that defined her life now condemned her. When Myers stood once again outside her house that week, watching her through the window as she sat alone at her dining table, he felt a strange mix of disgust and pity. She wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. No rage, no frenzy, no madness. Just a cold vacancy, an emptiness disguised as control. He turned to Ramsey and said quietly, "She didn't snap. She planned this like a verdict." Ramsey looked at him, brow furrowed. "So what happens now?" He sighed. "Now we make the arrest, before she starts writing her appeal." The turning point came quietly, buried in the sterile hum of the Baltimore Medical Examiner's lab. There were no dramatic revelations, no cinematic confessions, just the slow, relentless work of science doing what emotion could not. For nearly 2 weeks, toxicologists had combed through every tissue sample, every trace element, every anomaly in the systems of Richard, Daniel, Grace, and Elliot Hartman. It was tedious, meticulous work, the kind that blurred the line between persistence and obsession. But then, one sleepless night, under the glow of a single fluorescent bulb, Dr. Lydia Reeves saw something that made her heart slow. It wasn't what she found. It was what she didn't. Every toxin leaves a fingerprint, a molecular echo that tells a story of how the body tried to fight back. Arsenic leaves lesions in the skin. Cyanide chokes the blood with almond scent. Morphine saturates the liver. But in the Hartman case, there was silence. An absence so perfect it was almost unnatural. The initial tests had shown traces of zolpidem, yes, but the levels were identical across all 4 victims, down to the decimal. Reeves had never seen that before. No 2 bodies metabolized the same chemical in identical ways. Not even twins. It was as if each dose had been measured and administered with laboratory precision. She called Myers the moment the data printed. "You said she was a judge, right?" she asked. Her tone was measured, but something in it made him sit up straighter. "Yeah, retired." "Why?" Reeves hesitated. "Because whoever did this didn't guess. They calculated. These weren't overdoses. This was a procedure." Myers rubbed his eyes. "Procedure? The levels are uniform, precisely matched. That doesn't happen by accident. Someone dosed them deliberately, not to knock them out, but to kill them cleanly. No spasms, no vomit, no pain. It's clinical. And whoever it was, they knew how the body worked." Her words echoed through Myers's mind long after he hung up. The perfect family, the perfect house, the perfect death. The symmetry of it all chilled him. He'd seen organized killers before, people who planned every step of a crime. But this was different. This wasn't passion or rage. It was geometry. That same day, a new piece of evidence arrived from the forensic chemistry unit. A chemical analysis of the residue found in the small vial retrieved from Evelyn's trash. It contained traces of a compound called etomidone B, an experimental sedative developed for cardiac surgeries. Powerful, undetectable after 36 hours, and not approved for public use. Only 3 medical institutions in the state had access to it for research. One of them was Baltimore Mercy Hospital, where Richard Hartman had worked for over 20 years. Myers and Ramsey exchanged glances as the pieces fell into place. If Evelyn had access to her husband's credentials, which, as his spouse and former legal consultant, she easily could have, ordering the compound would have been simple. But the real question wasn't how she'd done it. It was why. What transformed a woman of law into a woman of calculated murder? That night, Myers returned to his office long after everyone else had gone home. The city outside was wrapped in rain and neon, the streets slick and shining. He flipped through Evelyn's file for the 100th time, her photographs staring back at him. Public, polished, professional. Every image of her exuded control. Even in candid shots, her posture was perfect, her expression deliberate. There was something haunting about that consistency. It was as though her entire existence had been a performance, one she refused to step out of even when the curtain had already fallen. Ramsey appeared at the door, holding 2 coffees. "You should go home," she said softly. "You're starting to look like the dead ones." Myers managed a tired smile. "You ever notice something about her?" he said, tapping the folder. "In every photo, every interview, every quote, she's never once not in control. It's like control was her religion. Maybe that's what this is about. Losing it." Ramsey leaned against the doorframe. "Losing control?" He nodded. She retired. Her kids didn't need her. Her husband was the one being celebrated. She spent her life judging others, and then the world stopped needing her judgment. Maybe this was her way of taking it back. The next morning, Reeves summoned them to the lab again. Her findings were ready, and they were devastating. The presence of etomidone B had been confirmed in all 4 victims. The compound had been masked by the sedative traces, metabolized cleanly, leaving no external symptoms. Reeves's conclusion was unequivocal. This was premeditated homicide. Myers stood silent for a moment, letting the gravity of it sink in. The elegance of the crime, the precision, the way it mimicked natural causes. It all pointed to someone with knowledge of law, medicine, and timing. Evelyn had lived among all 3. But the real revelation came when Reeves placed a photograph on the table, a magnified image from Grace Hartman's autopsy. "Look here," she said, pointing to the inner lip tissue. "Microscopic abrasion, same in Daniel and Elliot. Someone used a syringe, Microdose injections under the tongue, fast-absorbing, invisible from the outside. Probably done during dinner when they toasted. The image hit Myers like a blow. He could see it now. The scene replaying in his mind in eerie silence. The glitter of candlelight, the raised glasses. Evelyn's graceful hand moving between them, touching a shoulder, a cheek, a glass. The perfect hostess, administering death in sips and smiles. He took a step back, the enormity of it pressing down. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "She killed them mid-conversation." Reeves nodded grimly. And she knew exactly what she was doing. By afternoon, the lab report was enough for a warrant. They would search every inch of that house. Again, this time with precision and purpose. When the team arrived, Evelyn greeted them at the door with her usual poise, though her voice trembled slightly when she asked to see the paperwork. "Of course," she said after reading it. "Do what you must." As the investigators moved through her home, opening drawers, photographing files, cataloging the intimate architecture of her secrets, Evelyn sat in the living room, hands folded, eyes fixed on the portrait above the fireplace. It was a painting of her family. Richard in his white coat, Grace in her scrubs, Daniel in a tailored suit, Elliot with a sketchbook in hand. Their smiles were small but sincere. She had commissioned it years ago when the world still made sense. Now it seemed to mock her. In the study, Ramsey opened a small locked cabinet beneath the desk. Inside, neatly arranged, were folders labeled with dates, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months before the murders. Each contained notes written in Evelyn's looping, methodical handwriting, legal citations, case numbers, and beneath them, lines of what appeared to be dosage calculations. In one folder, a page stood out, written across the top in blue ink. Variable metabolism rates. Precision requires equality. It was a manifesto disguised as data. Evelyn had treated her family's deaths like a legal case, one she had prepared, argued, and executed with cold detachment. Myers stood by the window staring at the darkening sky. The air in the house felt thick, haunted. "She thought this was justice," he murmured. "Not murder. Judgment." Ramsey closed the file and met his eyes. "Then let's deliver the verdict." That evening, as the evidence was logged and catalogued, Evelyn sat alone in her chair, her calm composure beginning to fracture. She could hear the faint murmur of voices from the next room, the clicks of cameras, the low hum of radios. Her mind wandered, to the dinner, to the laughter, to the brief flicker of hesitation that had nearly stopped her hand. But it hadn't. Nothing had. Because in her mind, she had already written the ending long before it began. When Myers returned to the living room, she looked up at him, her eyes steady once more. "It was beautiful, wasn't it?" she said quietly. He froze. "What was?" "The evening," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Everything in its place, everyone together, no arguments, no disappointments, just peace." She smiled faintly. "The kind of peace we never had in life." Myers stared at her, his throat tight with disbelief. "You call that peace?" She met his gaze without flinching. "You call it justice." The words hung in the air, soft, deliberate, venomous in their calm. By the time they escorted her to the car, the sky had gone dark. The house loomed behind her, silent and perfect, a mausoleum of her own making. As the cruiser door closed and the city lights flickered against the glass, Evelyn allowed herself one final glance at the home she'd built and destroyed, brick by brick, judgment by judgment. And somewhere deep inside the labyrinth of her mind, she believed she had done nothing wrong. For a woman who had built a life on the assumption that systems bend to logic, the unraveling felt almost cruelly theatrical. It began with small, merciless things. A neighbor's security camera capturing a shadow at the kitchen door, a backup hard drive revealing an edited version of a document no one had seen before, an offhand comment from a distant cousin that suddenly made sense in a new, terrible light. The city's appetite for scandal was insatiable. What had been a closed investigation in the sterile rooms of the medical examiner's office quickly metastasized into a public drama. Evelyn Hartman's face, once associated with solemn pronouncements from the bench, was now plastered across news crawls and talk shows, her measured phrases replayed and dissected by pundits who had never met her. The metamorphosis from respected jurist to accused murderer was not instantaneous, but the velocity at which her life collapsed made it feel inevitable, like a building struck by a single perfect storm that exposed every internal fracture at once. Inside the courthouse, the machinery of justice began to hum in a new register. Prosecutors who had once greeted Evelyn with deference now treated her as the central figure in a case that challenged the moral instincts of everyone who had known her. Natalie Warren and her team methodically assembled the evidence: financial records that showed the offshore accumulation of funds, the medical procurement trail that led back to a handful of suppliers, the encrypted messages between Evelyn and Adrian Cole that suggested more than mere flirtation. Each piece was a shard, and when they laid the shards side by side, the picture that emerged was grimly coherent. A woman who had planned an escape so total it required the permanent removal of everything she had used to define herself. The prosecution's narrative was elegant in its cruelty. Evelyn had not killed in passion. She had executed a verdict on the people she once called family. But elegance in a courtroom is never enough. Defense counsel, led by Howard Feinstein, arrived with counterweights: plausible alternative explanations, procedural objections, and a deep, practiced skepticism about the certainty of forensics. Feinstein was the kind of lawyer who had made a career of finding the frayed end of an otherwise taut rope and pulling it until it unraveled. He argued loudly, and sometimes convincingly, that correlation is not causation, that a methodical mind could be mistaken for a calculating one, and that grief takes strange forms. He planted seeds of doubt. Maybe Adrian was the architect. Maybe the lab's chain of custody had an opening. Maybe a disgruntled colleague with access to experimental sedatives had manipulated the inventory. The questions he raised were not always persuasive, but they were enough to remind jurors that certainty is a fragile thing, especially when wielded against a woman whose life had been built on the presumption of fairness. Meanwhile, the personal pressure on Evelyn intensified in ways that were exquisitely human. The community she had once steered with a mixture of admiration and intimidation now subjectified her. School board members whispered, neighbors averted their eyes, and longtime friends offered condolences that smelled faintly of relief. Letters arrived, some pleading for mercy, some laced with vitriol, and each one left a residue on her skin she could not scrub away. Her phone, once a device of appointments and genteel obligations, became a pulsing instrument of accusation. Subpoenas, press inquiries, the occasional anonymous threat. She found herself developing a list of small superstitions, checking that locks clicked 3 times, leaving a single lamp on in the living room to mark that the house was watched. Superstition replaced ritual. Control frayed into an anxious choreography. At the heart of the unspooling was Adrian Cole, a man who had once shared late-night confidences with Evelyn and who now sat on the witness stand, watched by people who had read their texts and imagined the intimacy and treachery in equal measure. Adrian's testimony was complicated and at times pitiable. He admitted the affair but insisted the talks of starting over had been rhetorical, the kind of fantasy lovers whisper when reality refuses to meet them. He confessed to being naive, to interpreting Evelyn's heated talk of freedom as metaphor rather than plan. But there were moments when his face betrayed something else, a flicker of responsibility, an unspoken admission that he had fed the ember and watched the blaze grow. Jurors watched his hands as he spoke, the slight trembling, the way his gaze flicked toward the defense table whenever Evelyn's name was uttered. To some, he was the wounded fool who had been manipulated. To others, he was an accomplice through complacency. Either way, his presence tightened the narrative web around Evelyn. The media, merciless and efficient, found its heroes and villains in this human drama. Talk shows debated the psychology of privilege and entitlement. Op-eds argued that Evelyn's crime, if she had committed it, exposed a systemic hypocrisy where those entrusted with justice could weaponize their knowledge against the very people they swore to protect. Others suggested the opposite, that media attention and moral panic had already convicted her in the court of public opinion, reducing a complex story to a morality play. The courthouse steps became a theater of competing narratives, a group of former clients of Evelyn's who insisted she'd always been fair, a coalition of victims' advocates who said the case showed how power breeds secrecy, and a small but vocal contingent who argued that the prosecution was a political witch hunt, the result of prosecutors eager for a headline-grabbing win. Inside the courtroom, the evidence assumed a new weight. The prosecution's expert witnesses, seasoned toxicologists and forensic accountants, translated arcane data into the kind of plain, devastating language that jurors could understand. They explained how identical concentrations in unrelated bodies could not be a quirk of biology. They described, without offering technical playbooks, why certain compounds dampen the body's reflexes in quiet, undetectable ways, and how modern forensics could nonetheless trace the fingerprints left behind in transactions, timestamps, and digital traces. Feinstein's team, equally adept, cross-examined the witnesses relentlessly, exposing uncertainties, amplifying margins of error, and reminding jurors that science, like law, is practiced by fallible people. It was legal chess, each move precise, each counterpoint calculated, and neither side willing to concede more ground than it absolutely had to. As the trial advanced, Evelyn's carefully constructed persona began to show hairline fractures. Where once there had been an impenetrable calm, there were now moments rusted with fatigue. She still sat with the posture of a judge, shoulders back, chin level, but around the eyes there was a shadow. She wrote notes in that neat, judicial hand, but sometimes her pen trembled, as if it had to carry more weight than muscle could bear. On cross-examination, she would occasionally speak in that cool, detached cadence her colleagues remembered from the bench. At other times, she dissolved into a kind of brittle anger, railing against a system she had helped to shape. "You are not the only one who knows how to question evidence," she snapped at one of the prosecutors, and the exchange made headlines for days. People tried to parse whether the outburst was a sign of a breaking spirit or a tactical performance meant to remind jurors she was both human and wronged. Outside the formalities of the trial, other forces exerted pressure that would prove deadly to Evelyn's composure. Private conversations leaked, carefully selected transcripts that depicted Adrian in an unflattering light, or financial records that made her look greedy and premeditated. The leak investigations led to finger-pointing within the prosecutor's office, the defense counsel, and the media outlets themselves. Each leak was a new puncture wound to the narrative, often offering a single sensational detail that changed how people viewed the whole. Where once the story was a series of legal allegations, now it felt like a myth being rewritten in real time. Evelyn recast alternately as betrayer, betrayed, monster, and martyr, depending on who held the microphone. Meanwhile, the psychological probes added a more intimate layer to the unpeeling. Evelyn underwent competency evaluations and psychological screenings in which trained professionals tried to parse the architecture of her mind. Those sessions were not like the courtroom drama. They were quieter, more invasive, the kind of moments that lay bare the humanity beneath a public figure's reputation. Psychologists described someone with a rigid internal logic, with obsessive tendencies and an intolerance for unpredictability. They noted a profound sense of entrapment, both literal and symbolic, that had shaped her thinking. Some experts framed her actions as the result of an identity collapse. Once she no longer had the bench to define her, she sought to reclaim control through any means necessary. Others cautioned against overly simplistic interpretations, pointing out that many retirees feel purposeless without resorting to violence. The psychological testimony added texture to the prosecution's narrative and nuance to the defense's pleas, complicating public readiness to deliver a verdict in their hearts and minds. Family members, those left alive and shattered, were forced to navigate grief in an arena of public spectacle. Robert, Grace's fiancé, spoke in measured tones at the memorial service, his voice steady but raw, barely beneath the surface, as he remembered the warmth of Grace's laugh, the quick kindness she offered children in her care. Julia, Daniel's widow, retreated from view. Her social media shuttered, while Elliot's partner tried to stitch a life back together from fragments of planning boards and shared dreams. Each public appearance by family or friends was scrutinized for signs of fraud or authenticity. People wondered, how do you mourn when the accused is the one who should be mourning with you? The paradox was both painful and surreal. The bereaved were simultaneously victims and witnesses, a fact that made every testimony braided with personal agony and courtroom exigency. As the trial moved into its later stages, the defense attempted a last pivot. The image of a woman at the end of her rope, someone whose despair had manifested not as malice, but as a catastrophic misjudgment. They called character witnesses, former clerks, colleagues, community leaders, people who painted a portrait of a life dedicated to fairness and duty. Those who rose to speak of Evelyn's fairness did so with sincerity. Some admitted they were stunned, others confessed they had never seen the private side of her, and a few offered grudging, sorrowful statements about the complexity of human behavior. The prosecution, however, countered with the relentless logic of compiled evidence. The financial gains, the timing of purchases, the calculated efforts to control the narrative after the deaths. Every instance of human complexity the defense offered was met with another hard, corroborating fact from the prosecution's binders. In the quiet hours when cameras rolled away and courthouse staff shepherded the last of the witnesses home, Evelyn lay awake in her cell, sleep a thin, unforgiving thread. She had known the system from the inside. She had believed, perhaps to the end, that knowledge could protect her from suspicion. Yet those very skills, her ability to anticipate, to strategize, to manage perception, became the instruments used to unmake her. She thought about the day she had taken the bench, the crispness of the robe, the weight of responsibility, the parade of lives that passed through her courtroom. She thought about the dinners, the host's smiles, the precise pour of red wine, the tiny, almost meaningless gestures that now felt charged with a terrible significance. The memory of the family portrait above the fireplace returned, but in the dark, the painted smiles looked as if they were carved from another life, a life she had both loved and come to loathe. When closing arguments began, the courtroom held its breath. The prosecutor walked the jury through the coherent narrative they had assembled, tethering emotion to evidence in a way that made the case feel less like speculation and more like a ledger balanced with cold precision. The defense reminded them that reasonable doubt is the cornerstone of the jury's duty, that the prosecution's story, however elegant, still contained assumptions and gaps. Jurors were ordinary citizens thrust into the solemn work of deciding whether a life should lose its liberties because of actions allegedly taken in a private home. Their burden was heavy, and the noise outside the courthouse, editorialized opinion, social media fervor, the weight of public expectation, pressed on them in ways both obvious and subtle. On the final day, as the judge read instructions and jurors were dismissed to deliberate, The city felt suspended. People argued on park benches, in coffee shops, in late-night bars, about whether justice had been done for the victims and whether a system that could be manipulated by those in power had been exposed. The Hartman mansion, once a tableau of domestic precision, stood quiet and watched, its windows reflecting the shifting light of a society forced to contend with a terrifying and complicated truth, that someone entrusted with power could transform that trust into a weapon. The deliberations would ultimately decide Evelyn Hartman's fate, but by then the unraveling had done something else that could not be undone. It had forced a community to look at itself, to ask uncomfortable questions about power, identity, and the ways we shield ourselves from the consequences of the lives we construct. In that sense, the case had already delivered a verdict of sorts, one that would echo long after a juror's pencil marked a verdict form. And as the jury retreated behind the closed doors of the deliberation room, the rest of the city waited, riven between faith in the system and the knowledge that systems are run by fallible, complicated humans who sometimes break in ways that shake everyone around them. The verdict came down on a gray November afternoon that seemed designed for tragedy. The city was blanketed in a fine mist, the kind that blurred the edges of everything: buildings, faces, certainties. In the courthouse, the air carried that strange, anticipatory silence that only verdict days have, when every sound feels amplified and every movement carries weight. Reporters lined the corridors, murmuring into microphones, their breath fogging in the cold. Inside, 12 ordinary citizens sat in a row, their faces taut with the heaviness of decision. When the foreman stood, there was a pause, long enough for 100 hearts to beat once, twice, then stop. We, the jury, find the defendant, Evelyn Grace Hartman, guilty on all counts. It was a sentence delivered without ceremony, just words spoken into air, but they hit with the quiet finality of a door closing. In that instant, Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't gasp or plead. She simply blinked once, as if absorbing an expected outcome. To those who watched her, it looked like composure. To those who knew her, it looked like surrender. The courtroom erupted around her. Gasps, scribbling pens, the rustle of fabric as people turned to see her face. But she remained still, her posture as straight as it had been the day she took her judicial oath. Her attorney placed a gentle hand on her arm, whispering something, maybe a reassurance, maybe a plea for calm. But she didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed ahead, on the seal of the state of Maryland carved above the bench. For the first time, it seemed to look down at her not with authority, but with judgment. The bailiff's voice cut through the noise, steady and procedural. The defendant will be remanded into custody pending sentencing. It was strange, almost ironic. The same words she had spoken countless times herself, now echoing back at her like a ghost. When the deputies approached, the room seemed to shrink. The murmurs faded to whispers, then to nothing. The sound of the cuffs clicking shut, soft, metallic, absolute, carried through the silence like punctuation at the end of a long, damning sentence. Some in the gallery turned away. Others couldn't look anywhere else. The image of the once revered judge, her hands now bound, was too extraordinary to process. Outside the courthouse, the storm had thickened into drizzle. The reporters surged forward as Evelyn was led down the steps, their shouts cutting through the damp air. "Judge Hartman, do you have any comment? Do you regret your actions? Were you trying to escape justice?" She didn't answer. The cameras caught every second, the rain streaking across her face, the wet hair clinging to her temple, the way her lips parted slightly, as if she might speak but changed her mind. There was no defiance in her expression, no panic, only a strange stillness, the stillness of someone who had been living her punishment long before it was pronounced. At the precinct, the process unfolded with bureaucratic precision. Fingerprints, paperwork, a photograph that would circulate endlessly, the official record of her fall from grace. The camera flash bleached her face, making her look older, fragile, human in a way that no one had ever seen before. She studied the image afterward when the clerk slid it across the counter for verification. "That's me," she said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried a gravity that filled the room. Her cell that night was small, almost antiseptic. A narrow cot, a metal sink, a barred window that opened to nothing but the hum of city traffic below. She sat on the edge of the bed, the thin blanket pooled around her ankles, and listened to the distant rhythm of the rain. There was no clock, but she could tell time by the changes in the corridor. The distant footsteps of guards, the clank of doors, the brief murmur of voices that came and went like the tide. It was in those quiet hours that the enormity of what she had done finally began to settle in, not in a rush of guilt or panic, but in small, creeping realizations. The family portrait above the fireplace, the echoes of laughter at the dinner table, the sound of Richard's steady breathing at night. They had all become artifacts now, sealed behind the glass of memory. She tried to summon their faces in her mind, but they came in fragments, blurred and indistinct. For the first time, she felt the full weight of what it meant to erase something from the world. When Myers visited her the next morning, the look on his face was neither triumphant nor cruel. It was tired. He had seen too many endings to take pleasure in this one. "You held it together in court," he said quietly, sitting across from her. "I wasn't sure you would." Evelyn gave a faint smile, though her eyes stayed distant. "It's easier when you already know the outcome." Myers studied her for a long moment. "You planned everything, down to the minute, down to the breath. But why leave all that evidence? Why make it traceable?" She tilted her head slightly, as though considering the question. "Because I wanted to be understood," she said. "Not forgiven, just understood. I wanted someone to see the logic. The logic of killing your family. The logic of ending something that had already died," she replied softly. "You call it murder. I call it conclusion." Myers exhaled, a sound halfway between disbelief and exhaustion. "You spent your life teaching people that justice comes from order," he said. "But what you did was order," she interrupted, "just not yours." He stood slowly, gathering his notes. "Maybe not," he said. "But now it's mine again." After he left, Evelyn returned to her cot, her hands resting on her lap. Outside the barred window, dawn was beginning to break, a thin silver light spreading across the concrete walls. For a moment, she closed her eyes and imagined the sound of the courtroom again, the shuffle of papers, the low murmur of voices, the solemn pronouncement of judgment. It was strange how even now that world still felt closer to her than the one she inhabited. In the weeks that followed, the story of her arrest became less a headline and more a cautionary tale. Talk shows dissected her psychology. Documentaries reassembled her life from trial footage and interviews. She became both symbol and warning, a reminder of what happens when brilliance curdles into arrogance, when control becomes a cage too tight to escape. And yet for all the noise surrounding her, Evelyn herself faded into silence. In prison, she became another case file, another inmate in a system she once ruled. Her days followed the rhythm of institutional life. Wake, count, eat, wait. The grand architecture of her former existence, the courtrooms, the dinner parties, the elegant house on Greenvale Avenue, had been replaced by monotony, and strangely, she didn't fight it. Perhaps, in the absence of control, she finally found a kind of peace. Sometimes, late at night, she thought of her family, not as they had died, but as they had lived, laughing, arguing, moving through the beautiful, complicated machinery of life that she had once mistaken for chaos. In those moments, she felt something close to grief, though it came without tears. It was an ache, quiet and deep, like a bruise beneath the skin. And somewhere in the quiet of that cell, as the world moved on without her, Evelyn Hartman finally faced the one judgment she could not overrule, her own. By the time Evelyn Hartman's sentencing hearing arrived, her case had become more than a story. It had become a mirror. Across dinner tables, classrooms, and television panels, people debated what her fall said about justice, morality, and the quiet rot of ambition. Newspapers no longer called her Judge Hartman. They called her by name only, stripped of title and honorific, as if the removal of those words could undo the life she had built with them. Her trial had stretched over months, a spectacle of precision and theater, and when it finally reached its conclusion, the city seemed exhausted, drained by its own fascination. The courthouse that morning was crowded beyond capacity. The line stretched down the marble steps, around the iron gates, spilling into the drizzle. Inside, the air was tense with anticipation, the kind that precedes both celebration and disaster. Journalists, commentators, and onlookers filled every seat, their pens and cameras ready. The front row was reserved for what remained of the victims' families, the in-laws, cousins, friends, people who had been drawn into the orbit of tragedy, whether they wanted it or not. Some came seeking closure, others curiosity. Evelyn entered the courtroom, escorted by 2 officers, her posture as composed as ever. The gray of her prison uniform dulled her once commanding presence, but there was still something deliberate in the way she moved, as though each step carried its own punctuation. The murmurs that rippled through the room quieted as she took her seat. She looked neither humbled nor defiant, merely resolute, as if the outcome had long since become irrelevant to her. Judge Marianne Lowell, a contemporary of Evelyn's from the bench, presided over the sentencing. The irony was not lost on anyone, one judge delivering the final word to another. Lowell had once called Evelyn the finest legal mind of her generation. Now she studied her with a kind of weary sorrow, the way one might regard a monument ruined by its own weight. The proceedings began with the prosecution's closing address, a methodical recitation of evidence, motive, and moral reckoning. "The law," the prosecutor said, his voice steady but heavy, "is built on the belief that those entrusted with it will never wield it for their own ends. The defendant did not act out of passion or madness. She acted out of will, and that makes this crime not just personal, it makes it systemic." His words hung in the air like smoke, lingering in the corners of the room. When the defense rose, Howard Feinstein's tone was different, softer, almost pleading. "We do not excuse what has happened," he began, "but we must understand it. This was not a monster. This was a woman broken by the same system she once served. A woman who spent a lifetime absorbing the worst of humanity until she lost faith in her own." He spoke of her years on the bench, her impeccable record, her decades of service to justice. He invoked empathy without demanding it. And for a fleeting moment, even the cold efficiency of the courtroom softened. Then came Evelyn's turn. When she stood, the sound of her chains brushing against the floor seemed to echo louder than any voice. She faced the judge, her eyes steady. "Your Honor," she began, her voice low but clear, "I have listened to every word spoken here, and I understand the conclusion you will reach. I do not deny my actions. I only deny the assumption that they came from cruelty. I believed, wrongly or rightly, that I was correcting an imbalance. My family lived by the same standards I did: control, perfection, reputation. We built a life on order, and I believed that by ending it, I was sparing it from decay." There was a murmur in the gallery, a collective intake of breath. Evelyn paused, letting the silence stretch before continuing. "If I could name my crime," she said softly, "it would not be murder. It would be arrogance. The arrogance to believe I understood the world better than it understood me." Her gaze flicked briefly toward the rows of faces staring back at her. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect understanding. But I will not pretend I was blind to what I did. I saw it clearly, and that perhaps is punishment enough. For a long time after she sat down, the courtroom remained silent. The kind of silence that feels alive, pulsing with thoughts too large for words. Judge Lowell adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her tone carried both authority and sorrow. "Evelyn Grace Hartman," she said, "you spent your life teaching others that justice must never be personal. But you forgot that justice, by its nature, is human. You used your brilliance not to uphold it, but to bend it to your will. The court cannot restore what you destroyed. It can only acknowledge the truth of what you've done." She paused, glancing at the file before her as though it contained not evidence, but history. "You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." There was no gasp, no outcry, just a faint shifting of bodies, a collective exhale that seemed to drain the air from the room. Evelyn's face did not change. Her eyes drifted toward the ceiling for a brief moment as though seeking something unseen, then lowered again. When the bailiffs moved to escort her away, she stood without resistance. The clinking of her restraints seemed almost rhythmic, a final punctuation mark to a story that had already been written in the minds of everyone present. Outside, cameras flashed like lightning. The crowd surged forward as the officers guided her down the courthouse steps. Her name was shouted again and again, each call twisting her identity a little further from the woman she had once been. But Evelyn did not look up. She kept her eyes forward as if she had already left this world behind. The news coverage that night was relentless. Every network carried the story, every anchor giving it a name that would stick in the public imagination. The judge who killed for control. Analysts debated her psychology. Commentators dissected her final words, treating them like scripture. The nation watched, transfixed, as clips of her sentencing played on loop, her calm voice, her quiet confession, her steady eyes. She became a symbol again, but this time of something far darker. The frailty of reason when turned inward. In the months that followed, the city moved on, as cities always do. New scandals replaced the old, new tragedies demanded attention. Yet the memory of the Hartman case lingered like a shadow on the civic conscience. Law schools dissected it as a cautionary study, sociologists wrote papers on moral entropy, documentary producers secured rights to her story. Evelyn Hartman, once a judge, had become a narrative, an allegory about the dangers of intellect divorced from empathy. And yet, inside the prison walls, she existed outside of all that noise. Her days fell into the rhythm of routine, the clang of morning roll call, the rationed light through the narrow window, the sound of footsteps in the corridor. Time became elastic, both endless and fleeting. Sometimes she would catch herself imagining the courtroom again, the echo of her own gavel striking wood. But even those memories began to fade, replaced by the quiet hum of confinement. One afternoon, during a scheduled evaluation, a young psychologist asked her if she still believed she had done the right thing. Evelyn looked at him for a long time before answering. "There is no right thing," she said finally. "There's only the thing you can live with, and I live with this." He nodded, unsure whether it was defiance or despair. Perhaps it was both. Outside, the world continued to speak her name, to argue about her motives, to reconstruct her story in ways that suited their own narratives. But for Evelyn, the arguments no longer mattered. She had once believed truth was a thing that could be controlled, weighed, reasoned. Now, she understood it was a current, something that carried you whether you fought it or not. And in that understanding there was, at last, a kind of silence she could call her own. Years slipped by like pages turning in a book no one was reading anymore. Outside the prison walls, the world moved on. New scandals, new headlines, new names for the public to dissect and devour. But inside, time was slower, heavier. It collected in the corners like dust. Evelyn Hartman, once a woman whose every decision rippled through courtrooms and careers, had become an inmate known only by a number and a schedule. Her power, her titles, her carefully curated life, all dissolved into the bland sameness of institutional existence. Yet within that monotony, a strange kind of order re-emerged, one she could finally live inside without pretense. Her mornings began before sunrise. The pale light filtered through the bars, painting the concrete in shades of silver. She would sit at the edge of her cot, hands folded neatly in her lap, and listen to the quiet murmur of the building waking. The rattle of keys, the shuffle of shoes on linoleum, the muted voices of guards exchanging shifts. It reminded her, oddly, of the courthouse in those early hours before session, when the world still felt composed and waiting for her command. Only now she commanded nothing. Inmates learned quickly who she was. Some treated her with reverence, others with curiosity, a few with disdain. But Evelyn had no interest in alliances or gossip. She spent her days reading whatever she could get: old legal texts, philosophy, history, novels she'd once dismissed as indulgent. The prison library became her courtroom, her sanctuary. Over time, she even began tutoring other inmates preparing for their GED exams. She corrected grammar, explained logic, debated ethics, not as a judge or a teacher, but as a woman who had finally stopped performing. There was something oddly redemptive in it, though she never called it that. Redemption required belief, and Evelyn had long stopped believing in absolutes. She simply found rhythm again, and in that rhythm, a muted kind of peace. Still, on certain nights, when rain drummed against the narrow window and the power flickered, she would close her eyes and see flashes of her old life, her children's faces, her husband's laughter, the warmth of a home that now existed only in the collective imagination of strangers. The guilt came not in floods, but in quiet waves, never enough to drown her, always enough to remind her she was still human. Years passed. Her hair turned white, her back slightly stooped, but her mind remained sharp as glass. Prison administrators occasionally invited her to speak to younger officers about psychology and ethics. "You know," one of them said once, half-jokingly, "you'd make a good instructor." She smiled at that, a faint, almost ironic smile. "I made a terrible one the first time around," she replied. Outside, the legend of Evelyn Hartman had evolved into something mythic. She became a lecture topic in universities, a character in crime dramas, the subject of documentaries narrated in solemn tones about power and downfall. Some portrayed her as a symbol of moral decay, others as a victim of perfection turned inward. Law students argued whether her actions were premeditated logic or emotional collapse. But none of them really knew her, not the woman who sat in a cold room every night, tracing invisible lines on her wrist where the robe once brushed against her skin. Occasionally, letters would arrive, students seeking insight, journalists asking for interviews, strangers offering prayers or curses. She rarely replied, but one envelope caught her attention. It was from Robert, her late daughter's fiancé. The handwriting was unsteady, but the tone was calm. "I've hated you," he wrote, "and I've tried not to. I've spent years wondering why. But the truth is, I'll never understand it. And maybe that's the punishment that belongs to me, not you. Grace loved you. I think she always wanted your approval, even when she pretended she didn't. I don't forgive you, but I think I finally see the human being beneath the monster they made of you." She read that line again and again until the words blurred. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. And somehow, that was harder to bear. The final decade of her life unfolded in stillness. Her body began to betray her, Joints stiffened, eyesight dimmed, the tremor in her hands worsened until even holding a pen became a deliberate act. The other inmates called her the judge, though half of them didn't know her real story. She had become a figure of quiet authority, someone people turned to for advice or mediation. Ironically, within those walls, she had become what she once believed herself to be outside of them. A keeper of balance, stripped of ego, stripped of illusion. It was on a winter morning, years after her conviction, that a young guard found her sitting motionless on her cot, her head tilted slightly toward the window. The first light of dawn touched her face, catching the faint smile that lingered there. The medical staff would later note the absence of struggle, the stillness of her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had gone quietly, as though she'd simply reached the end of an argument and finally accepted the verdict. Her passing made the news briefly. Another headline, another echo of the story the world thought it already knew. Disgraced judge dies in prison after 2 decades behind bars. Most readers glanced past it. A few paused long enough to remember her name, then moved on. Only those who had stood in that courtroom, who had seen her eyes when the verdict was read, felt a faint, inexplicable sadness. In her cell, among her few personal possessions, they found a small notebook. Its pages were filled not with defenses or legal arguments, but with reflections, short, unpunctuated thoughts written in a hand that grew shakier over time. One entry read, "There is no justice without empathy. There is no truth without error, and there is no peace without surrender." Another, near the end, simply said, "If order was my God, then silence is my confession." The notebook was handed to the warden, who placed it in storage, never realizing its worth. Decades later, a graduate student researching judicial ethics would uncover it, sparking a new wave of fascination. Her words, stripped of context, were interpreted as profound philosophy. Few realized they were written by a woman who had lost everything to understand them. In the end, Evelyn Hartman became what she had always sought to be, a case study in the human condition. Her story outlived her, reshaped by time and retelling, becoming less about crime and more about the eternal tension between order and chaos, reason and emotion, justice and mercy, and perhaps, in that final balance, somewhere between the world's condemnation and her own acceptance, she found the quiet truth she had been chasing all her life, that no verdict is ever final, and that even the guilty carry within them the faint pulse of redemption. Years after her death, the name Evelyn Hartman lived on in fragments, not as a woman, but as an idea. Her story was no longer told as a crime, but as a question, whispered through lecture halls, documentaries, and dimly lit conversations about human nature. Professors used her case to illustrate ethical paradoxes. Filmmakers turned her into a cautionary silhouette of power consumed by itself. To some, she was a monster. To others, a tragic philosopher who saw too much and folded under the weight of her own insight. But history, as always, reshaped her. A new generation, detached from the scandal and emotion of her time, began to look at her not through outrage, but through curiosity. What does it take for a person so deeply entrenched in justice to mistake control for salvation? What line must one cross before righteousness turns inward, devouring its source? Evelyn's case became a mirror that reflected the same uncomfortable truth her life had embodied, that every pursuit of perfection carries within it the seed of its own undoing. In one such documentary, a young narrator's voice posed the question plainly: was Evelyn Hartman evil, or simply human, in a way most of us are too afraid to admit? Archival footage showed her sentencing, the still image of her calm, resigned expression. The narrator's voice softened. Perhaps that's what makes her story endure, because somewhere beneath the verdict, beyond the horror, there's a part of her that feels familiar. the part that fears failure, that craves control, that mistakes silence for peace. For those who had once known her, the memory was more complicated. Detective Myers, long retired, occasionally revisited the case file, the papers yellowed, the ink faded. In an interview late in his life, he said, "I used to think I solved her. But the truth is, I only caught her. Solving her? That's something nobody ever did." Her house on Greenvale Avenue was eventually sold, renovated, and repainted. Families came and went, unaware of the story the walls had held. But on quiet evenings, neighbors swore that if you walked past the gate at dusk, you could feel something. Not haunting exactly, but presence. The residue of a life lived with too much order and too little grace. And in law schools and ethics seminars across the country, her name still appears, not as a warning against ambition, but as a reminder of complexity. Because the story of Evelyn Hartman, for all its tragedy, was never just about crime. It was about the fragility of certainty, about the fine line between reason and delusion, about what happens when a person builds their life so perfectly that it leaves no room for being human. Perhaps that is her real legacy, not the verdict, not the scandal, but the echo, that quiet, lingering question she left behind for the rest of us. If justice means balance, what happens when the scale itself becomes corrupt? The camera would fade to black on that line, the last gavel strike echoing faintly, fading into silence. The same silence that Evelyn Hartman had come to call peace.